Okay, hello everyone. Welcome on this Thursday. This is going to be a little bit different version of our monthly training webinar. And I can tell I'm looking at everybody filing in here. So this is good. I know that a lot of you are probably joining in from home or from wherever. Everybody's doing what they can nowadays. So I'm glad that you were able to join us today. So my name, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Scott Richards. I'm the Director of Training and Education here at Virtuous. I know I get to talk at you every month. This month, we're lucky we have a special guest. We have Noah Barnett. Noah is the Director of Partnerships and Community here at Virtuous. He is a well-versed fundraising expert. He has a lot of expertise in the field. And I'm glad he could join us today. He's going to add a lot of his thoughts and a lot of his color to some of the material that we talk about. And part of what we want to do today, too, is offer an expanded opportunity for some Q&A so that if you do have questions about some of the strategies that you can use or some of the steps that you can take in light of current events, you can ask me or you can ask Noah, and both of us can offer our 2 cents. So Noah, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'm excited to be on and to talk through this. Obviously, it's a tough time, but I'm excited to share some great opportunities that we can still take in the midst of the crisis.
Excellent. Well, so that everybody knows what we're going to be taking a look at today, we wanted to start by looking at the big picture and just look at fundraising in crisis. What does fundraising look like in a tough situation like this? Talk about one of the keys, really, just overall, segmentation is really going to be crucial in terms of how you're messaging. And what are some things to keep in mind as you're communicating with donors? And these are applicable to things you're doing in Virtuous, to conversations you're having with donors, just across the board, you know, some of the really high level view of what's going on. And then we'll take a look at some practical steps, some things that you can do right now in Virtuous. And I'm sure that all of you have already been kind of working together with your board and with everyone to figure out your response to this and how you're going to reach out to your donors. So you may have already taken some of these steps. If so, hey, maybe this will color some of what you've done. If not, maybe you can take some of these and you can implement them right away. We'll look at assigning some tasks to major gift officers or anybody who's managing relationships, how to identify some key segments. We've got a couple of quick segments that you can identify in your database. And then a really basic sample outreach workflow just to start pushing communication out to donors and reaching out to them and checking in with them. And then again, we want to make sure we have plenty of time to do some Q&A for everybody. So that's what we're going to look at today. And again, as we go through, Noah is certainly going to offer up his expertise. But first, if we want to talk about understanding what fundraising looks like in times of crisis, Noah and I were actually just talking about this before we started. I wanted to talk with some good news because it's a webinar called Fundraising in a Time of Crisis. Let's start off with something that's a little bit more positive. And the positive is that donors historically are resilient. Donors tend to support the causes that mean the most to them, really no matter what. And if you look at giving overall, historically, it's much less volatile than the market, the leading market indicators that we look at day in and day out. And that when you really look at it, the interesting thing, here's actually a chart. You can look at giving against the Dow, right? And when you look at some of this data and you look at giving versus, for example, the S&P, what you notice is that giving doesn't decrease. The market does. The market drops. The market is volatile. It goes up and down. But the giving will stop increasing, right? So growth can stagnate. Donors are, it's harder to acquire some of those new donors, but giving doesn't decrease, which is a good thing to keep in mind, right? Those donors that care about you and that have supported you, they want to keep supporting you and they want to see you be successful. That's the reason they gave to you in the first place. And that's the reason that they can continue to give to you in the future. Okay, so that's the good news for
Yeah,
everybody to
and
keep
Scott,
in mind.
just to
Oh,
add to this too, I think
yeah,
this
go
is
ahead.
such an important message for those that are leaders on their teams or guiding other people within your organization, is to keep this reminder at the forefront. I was talking to a consultant yesterday, and he was like, we have to remember we're in the hope business. And I think sometimes even internally, as things are chaotic and going back and forth, we lose sight of the bigger picture. And that's what I loved about Scott surfacing these, is because this showcases the bigger picture. Like it's we'll get through this. There is another side to this, and things will get better, even if they don't feel that way right now.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there have been some studies done. It's very hard to get all the data, but even looking back at the Great Depression, giving that was one of the only times giving actually decreased. It took a hit, but it started to rebound during the Depression, which is interesting. So yeah, so it is a positive thing, and it's an important thing to keep in mind because, like Noah said, it's everybody's kind of panicked right now. It's a time of a lot of fervor. And so to keep in mind that, hey, this is, it's not the end of the world. We're going to get through this is a good thing. Now, how you get through it and how you do those things, how you move forward. Well, one of the things you want to do, you want to evaluate your funding sources. And some of you have probably been sitting down and looking at this already, right? Looking at the mix of donations and gifts that you're receiving right now, because it is a time of economic stress. There's no two ways about it. And we're not sure how long this is going to last or what the next, the next big thing is going to look like here. But we do have a lot of historical indicators and a historical data at this point to be able to know that in times like this, you're typically going to see a decrease in grant funding, right? You're going to see a decrease in corporate giving. And in individual major gifts. Those are three things that are impacted by the market. As the market drops, there's less available for corporate giving and for grant funding simply because they're unsure about their endowments. They're unsure about the funding that they're going to have available to make those gifts. Grants that have already been committed, right? Most of these foundations and organizations have planned based on last year in terms of what they're going to give this year. And that's another important thing to keep in mind. There's a delay in some of the effects of this, right? Some of the effects of this are going to be felt a little further in the future in terms of grant funding and some of the corporate giving. But these are the types of gifts that are typically going to be most impacted in a time like this. However, with major gifts, there are two things to keep in mind. One of those is that major donors are more likely to make a planned gift if they make a gift. So focusing on bequests a little bit more at a time like this is one way to keep things afloat, right? That's one way to make sure that you are able to reach out to major donors. The other thing for major giving that I thought was really interesting, and it was actually something I hadn't thought about. And as I was looking at data and looking at research to try to see what are some of the things we want to look at here, major donors who give via a donor-advised fund, they are likely to continue giving at their level, right? So money paid into donor-advised funds, that's going to decrease, but payouts remain consistent. This is based on a report from National Philanthropic Trust. So because the money's already in that donor advised fund, it's not like that donor can go get it, take it out and spend it. So the giving from that fund doesn't get affected. It's them putting money into that donor advised fund. That's where you're going to see a decrease. So there are some ways that you can approach major donors. The key is identify those major donors who give via donor advised fund. Who are the folks who are in Virtuous pass-through givers, right? That are giving through Schwab Charitable and Fidelity Charitable and NCF, all of those different sorts of donors that are giving in that way. They are donors that you could still look to or try to rely on at a time like this. So I thought that was an interesting one to be able to surface. And again, those folks are pretty easily identifiable as pass-through givers. Noah, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
No, I don't think so, Scott. I think the point that's clear here is that everybody in your supporter base is impacted in different ways. Obviously, there is a shared experience, but individuals within your donor base are going to be impacted differently. So identifying those different types of segments and communicating with them in an individualized way is going to be really helpful as you move forward in the coming weeks.
And as you move forward, right, you do want to adjust your tactics, right? So once you've kind of evaluated your funding sources and you know, hey, if we've been overly reliant on grant funding, we need to make sure that we are looking more to our individual donor pool, or we know we're going to have to identify some more donors within our individual pool who can maybe step up and help make up that difference. Again, not this year, but perhaps next year, right? One of the other things that you're going to need to do as you start to reach out to those donors and you start to connect with them, you are going to have to adjust your tactics, especially for organizations that are dependent on events. It's going to be much more crucial to take those events online, to have virtual events instead of your typical in-person events, right? Right now, we can't do anything with more than 10 people, so it would be pretty impossible. And I know Noah's been having some conversations with other consultants too about this idea of what does a virtual event look like, right? How does that work? How can we do things that are a little bit different when we've been dependent on having our gala, or we've been dependent on having our 5K as our key source of income year over year, right? It's sort of a need to get creative.
Yeah, and just to add to that too, I think the key here is also exploring the space isn't just taking your event as it is today and making that virtual, but almost using the virtual idea actually as new design space to think about how you might even restructure events. Maybe it is smaller groups of people coming together around a specific cause or need that is related to your organization. It doesn't have to be a large scale event that's now just virtual. You can actually get really creative on actually doing smaller events or other types of engagement that brings donors together to connect while also still helping to move the mission and work that you're doing forward.
Excellent. Well, and you know what, folks, I should take a second to say, and those of you that have been on all of our training webinars know every month I take a second to lay out the ground rules. This month, I was so excited to get right into it. I didn't let everybody know two quick things. One, we are recording today's session. I didn't mention that at the top, but we are recording today's session. That'll be available in our training academy as always, so that you can share this with colleagues, so you can go back and find something maybe that you missed. And the other thing is, like I said, we do want to have plenty of opportunity for Q&A. As Noah is talking, as I'm talking, if there is a question that comes to you, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box. You should see that there on the little Zoom control panel there for the webinar. You can type that in, and then we'll address those questions as we get to that Q&A session, or section of this, I should say, a little bit later in the session. But please go ahead and send those in. We're happy to field questions. Okay, now in addition to taking events online, right, even your major donor outreach is going to have to go online. And so this means, and I know that there's been a lot of talk about this in the media even, using video calls in place of some of those personal meetings. And I know that that is tricky with some donors who might be older, who are not as comfortable with technology. So it might be a little bit harder to make some of those face-to-face connections. But certainly using the phone at the very least to reach out to people ear to ear and talk to them, check in on them, and have a conversation with them. This is a great time to do it. And I had seen a fundraising consultant actually posted on Twitter yesterday that he had been talking to a phone outreach organization, and they said, hey, contact rates are way up because everybody's home, right? So we're reaching people in a way that we haven't been able to reach them before. So it is a good opportunity, right? As dire as some of this is, it's a really good opportunity to have a chance to actually connect with your donors in a meaningful way and have a really meaningful conversation with them in ways you might not have been able to before. And as part of that, right, online giving, phone calls, and direct mail are even more important than they were before. There's going to be a lot of movement to online giving, especially with this idea of having a digital event as opposed to an in-person event, having those phone calls as opposed to face-to-face contact in some cases, and direct mail, which has never really gone away. But all of these sort of more indirect means of communication are going to be a lot more vital now than they were before. Now, as we talk about doing these things and reaching out to folks, segmentation is going to be critical to the communication that you're putting out there right now. Right? Segmentation is going to be a real key. And so the 3 keys to successfully segmenting, number 1, focus heavily on those donors who are really your loyal donors. One of the key indicators for who is it that is the most committed to your organization, right, is when you look at consecutive years giving. It's the same thing you look at when you're trying to identify who's a good planned giving candidate, as a matter of fact, is consecutive years giving, right? It's not even the amount. It's that person who's been giving as much as they could, but they give it like clockwork every month, every quarter, every year. They really want to see you be successful, and they're going to do everything they can to try to help you continue to be successful in a time like this. And so those are folks that you want to identify, and you do want to focus a little bit more of your effort on some of those donors.
Yeah, and Scott, just to add to this as well, is I think it's also important to get ahead of segments that might be impacted by the crisis. So for example, if you have recurring donors that are still giving to you now is actually the time to think about how we're going to continue to build the case for support and just reassure them that their support is still essential. I also think getting ahead of donors that typically give in March and April and have given historically in that, how do you get ahead of those and actually engage with them now before they don't take the action that maybe you expected them to take? So getting ahead of things is really important right now as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that is part of really personalizing the messaging that you're sending to specific groups, which is something that at Virtuous we've talked about a lot already, and now this is just even more important. And some of the ways that you can segment and personalize messaging, you can segment by age. Certainly, there's been a lot written, a lot of pixels spent in the last couple of days on how different generations, different age groups are responding to what's going on right now. By region, because certain regions are certainly being more impacted than others, and so your messaging may be different to folks in certain communities. And one of the interesting ones that I know Noah had brought up, he and I were having a conversation about this, was donor intent, and looking at the intent of your donor and how you message some of those folks, or how you speak to them in a little bit different way. That's important, again, all the time, but now it's a little bit more heightened than usual.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a great example of this is, even from like an arts organization, like if you have if you have patrons that donate to you, but they're also, benefit from your programs, they're obviously not benefiting from your programs right now, but they support your mission. So how do you bridge that gap between, in light of not being able to serve in our programs, we still need funding to be able to move our mission forward in other creative ways. Whereas maybe you have other donors that just support your organization because they support all the local nonprofits, because they're a local organization or a local donor who wants to invest in arts and culture, and gives, but typically doesn't come to your programming. You know, how you communicate to them might be different than you would communicate with someone that, you know, does engage with your programming. And so leveraging everything from donors' involvement to their interest to their intent is going to be key as you look for ways to personalize messages and make it super relevant. And I know, Scott, we talked a lot about this idea of relevancy right now. It's going to be even more important, not only just right now, but as we move forward. How do you continue to stay relevant? And I think personalization is a great tool to build up relevancy in your messaging.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we were going to talk about too, is how you can make sure that you're communicating the relevance of your mission today. It's really kind of an opportunity to not fully reevaluate your case statement, but take a look at your case statement and make sure that you're making your case pretty clearly in light of current events. And the other thing too that's critical whenever you're segmenting, but especially right now, but suggesting the right financial gift, right? And it's critical at a time when money is a concern, because we know that when you ask for a certain gift amount or even include an ask string, if you're not asking for the right amount, right? If you ask for too little, you leave money on the table. If you ask for too much, some donors may say, oh, I can't help, and so they won't give at all. And right now is not a time when you really can afford either of those things. And so you want to make sure that you're right sizing the ask for everybody based on their donation history to you, based on their level of commitment to you, right? In terms of looking at those loyal donors, those folks that have been committed, and that you're asking for the right amount for each donor. We actually looked at ways to do that in our last training webinar. We looked at some of the smart asks that you can use on donation forms. So as you are moving to more online fundraising, you have a way to make sure that you're asking for the right amount for each donor.
Yeah, and Scott, to comment on this too, is that it may make sense with certain segments of your donors to not ask for a financial gift right now. And it's really more important to be suggesting other ways that they might stay connected or get involved. And so I think it's also making sure that you're segmenting your suggestions to specific audiences. And that's why this idea of segmentation is so important. Because a certain audience, maybe they are major donors, or maybe they are long-term supporters of your organization, you can send a different message that might have a financial ask to those supporters, because they have a level of investment in your organization that's different than, say, new donors or donors that only gave to you because of a specific appeal you did last year. And so how are you appealing to these donors should be different than what you're suggesting. And that's built into responsive fundraising, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit too.
Absolutely. And some of you may know Clay Buck. He's a fundraising consultant. He's been president of his local AFP chapter. He's also a pretty great guy. Had a chat with him just yesterday, and he had mentioned segmentation being crucial at this time. And one of the things he mentioned was, hey, if you're an agency that isn't directly dealing with it and you've got a mass email list where only a small percentage are actual donors, you're going to alienate more than you will encourage. And I thought that was so crucial. I'm assuming everybody else has the same experience right now, where you're getting emails from every company that has ever gotten your email address. I personally got an email from a window company that I got a quote from about 8.5 years ago for replacement windows. I did not purchase windows from them. I don't own that home anymore. I don't even live in the same state, but they sent me an email to tell me how they were addressing coronavirus. So, that was one for me that I thought, well, it doesn't really make a difference to me. And that's where, hey, poor segmentation. They just grabbed every email address they've ever had and they blasted out that message, as opposed to really focusing that message and personalizing it for the right audience. Okay, and this is great. I see some questions coming in too. This is excellent. I'm trying to move through this as efficiently as we can. I want to make sure we have some time. But the other thing we mentioned is how to communicate with donors at a time like this, at a time when it is a crisis, and there's really three keys. So the first is you want to be transparent, right? Don't hide from the crisis. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. It's on your donors' minds. It's on your minds, and that's okay. I know sometimes people say, "Oh, should I not mention it? Should I not bring it up when I talk to a major donor? Do we not want to mention it in our appeal?" No, it's actually okay to mention it. I got an email from an arts organization locally here that I support, and it mentioned, hey, they had to cancel a chunk of their season. They are out some of the costs for that. They've had to push some other things back to the fall. They plan to keep going and keep going strong, but they were upfront about, hey, here's the impact to us, and here's what that means. And if what we do is as important to you as we think it is, here's how you can help. Great. I want to help. I would love to help. So don't hide it. Don't feel like you have to pretend that it's not happening. You can be transparent and be upfront with your donors. Again, if they care about you and they want to see you be successful, they're going to get that message, and they're going to step up to help you be successful. And this is the point that Noah made earlier too, which is focus on your relevance, right? In light of what's going on right now, what is it that makes your programs vital at this moment, right? What is it that makes them as crucial? That's an easy case to make if you're a food pantry right now. It's a harder case to make if you're an arts organization right now. But I know Noah was, we were talking the other day, he had the great example of some of the arts organizations right now that are making some educational content and other content available for folks who are homeschooling their kids, right? As one of the things that is really relevant that they're still doing right now.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of relevance reinforces the first point, because you don't want to hide the fact or ignore the fact that there's multiple crises going on, not just with the coronavirus and kind of the pandemic that we're all dealing with, but also the fact that the market volatility is all over the map right now. And donors are, especially if you think of the majority of donors are getting closer to retirement age or are in retirement, they're heavily being impacted by this in a very clear way. But then you have these younger donors that maybe do have kids at home. And so being clear on what you're doing and how it's impacting your organization. But then, like this point says, getting really creative on how you can bring your mission to life through different mediums. So like Scott mentioned, this arts organization is actually distributing programming through digital mediums, even though that's not their standard, operating procedure. And I think other organizations are thinking about how to do that as well. I know for me, we have been benefiting from a zoo who's actually doing digital safaris every afternoon for kids to engage. And, they have to be on site to take care of the animals. And they said, hey, let's put a camera on this and actually do a lesson on how these animals are, like, he's basically just teaching about these animals. And I think they have a suggested, hey, if this is beneficial to you, you're welcome to donate here. And I think on day one, they had 600 or 800 donations that came through because they just changed the way they were delivering their programming, and gave the opportunity for people to say, hey, if you find this valuable, we'd value your contribution. And so there's a lot of creative ways that you can use the constraints to actually further your mission or deliver your mission in unique ways.
Absolutely. And so you want to be transparent, right? And I think that part of that transparency, to be honest, is just be human, right? Don't forget to ask, how are you? I've told a couple people, like every call I've had in the last couple of days has started the same way, which is, hey, how are you? Where are you? Are you working from home? How's it going? Even more so than ever, right? Just checking in on one another and making sure that we're okay. Some people are doing just grand. Some people are not. And so reaching out and just connecting with people and listening to them and seeing how they're doing. You've got a lot of older donors and older volunteers, even not just donors, right? Like Noah mentioned, there's a large population of folks who are retirement age, beyond retirement, who are donors and volunteers. This is a great time to reach out to them. And this is a great time to really exercise one of those responsive principles of giving back, not just getting, but giving back to your donors. But right now might be a time they need your support. And that support can be as simple as having a voice on the phone and someone to talk to if they're stuck at home and they've been stuck at home for a while, right? Especially for that older demographic of donors, social isolation can be dangerous for folks who are older. And right now, a lot of them are being told, hey, stay at home. And they might be staying home alone by themselves, right? And these are just a couple of the things. I didn't want to pull a bunch of scary statistics. That seemed terrible. But, these are some of the realities that your donors and volunteers are facing beyond the realities that you are facing, right? And so keeping that in mind as you reach out to them and check in on them, I think is really important. It's always important to listen to your donors, but it's more important now than ever.
And just to add to that too, I think not only just the connection, but there's a lot of news and information flying around. And I was talking to a consultant yesterday, and she was encouraging nonprofits through this time to help be truth tellers in some ways, where they're actually kind of surfacing information that's important, especially as it relates to maybe the area of work that you're serving. So if you're serving like those that are affected by homelessness, or you're working in schools, like you're helping be a disseminator of valid and true information, because there's a lot of crosswires going on, and sometimes misinformation leads to increased fear. And so your organization can act as a distributor of, real solid information as it relates to the area or the cause area that you're working on. So keep that in mind as well as you engage with your supporters.
Yeah, and what this all kind of comes back to is you want to be transparent, you want to be human, and this really means being responsive, right? Responsive fundraising is something a lot of you have heard us talk about. You've probably heard Noah talk about it. I mean, he lives it and breathes it. It's what worked already, and what works still works, right? And is, again, probably even more important right now, right? To listen again to your donors, listen to those donor signals, connect on a personal level with all of them, and then suggest the right option. And like Noah said, the right option might not be a financial donation right now, but the only way to know that is to listen to them and to know who they are, what your organization means to them, and what the logical sort of next step for them is, especially at a time like this.
Yeah. And one of the things here that's super important and may not be as obvious is now is not a time to pull back. I think showing up, being quick to respond, sharing information, connecting with your donors, like now is not a time to kind of pull back on communication, but rather make sure that you're serving and being an advisor and an advocate for your donors and the people that you're serving through your mission, right now more than ever. And that's always the case, but I think there's a portion that's like, oh, should we pull back? Like, should we kind of just, let the news do, like we're not super relevant right now. And I don't think that's the case. You have to stay connected and serve your donors in the way that you've committed to. And I think now is more important than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, again, they're hearing from companies and organizations they probably don't really care about all that much, right? Everybody that they've ever bought anything from is bombarding them with some kind of messaging, whether they care about it or not. You're an organization that is, most likely much closer to their heart, and so they want to hear from you. And so this is the time to get out there and connect with them and communicate with them, and to make sure that you are maintaining that relationship with them, right? Giving is inherently personal. And so there is a personal connection to your organization already that goes above and beyond where they, what they order online or where they buy coffee from or something like that. And so keeping that in mind, right, it's not an intrusion to reach out to your donors. It would be an intrusion if you sent sort of a blanket appeal that didn't mention anything that was going on in the world, that was kind of tone deaf to what's happening right now and then said, please give us your money, that would be intrusive. But reaching out personally and connecting with them in a meaningful way, that's what they want and need from you right now.
Absolutely. And the other thing I'll mention, because a lot of this sounds scary because you have to maybe rewrite that spring appeal, or you have to break process and do things a little bit differently because, we're under different circumstances. That's okay. I was talking to T. Clay Buck yesterday, who Scott already mentioned, and we were saying now more than ever, it's time to kind of remove the polish or forego the polish, forego like the maybe dressier, more formalized business speak that you might talk through in other environments, and really get personal and human. I've received many messages from organizations. The ones that have connected with me the most, or I was like, wow, this organization is really trying, are the ones that are getting vulnerable. And they're even putting their CEOs on like a camera phone. And they're like, hey, or their founders or their executive directors or their director of advancement. And they're like, hey, we're in this, we're here. They're showing up and they're trying to communicate as clearly as possible, even if that is uncertainty. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind during this time, is that, it's better to show up and communicate and be personal, and forego that polish if that's not something you can do right now. And I think that's even better.
Yeah, and I think to steal something that I've heard Noah say before in terms of making emails sound or feel personal, I know Noah has mentioned before actually typing out emails on his phone instead of on the computer, so that they are just slightly more casual, I guess the wrong word, but they have a little bit more personal feel, because you kind of naturally are inclined to do a little bit more heightened sort of professional sort of typing or language when you're typing at a keyboard, right? When you're typing in your computer. And I have always thought that was a great sort of little trick to give a little
Yeah.
bit more personal voice.
Yeah, there's something about a Word document or an Outlook email function that kind of forces us to forget that we're all humans communicating with other humans. Sometimes we're like, wait a second, why am I typing that? The other thing I would encourage you to do too is to make sure we're reading our communication out loud. That's another great, just small tip to make sure it actually sounds human and personal. And another just tactic that I've been doing for years now is not even just typing on my phone, but I'll actually voice my message into written word, because it allows me to use my regular everyday language to actually formulate some of my thinking, and it comes off in a more personal way. And so that's just another tip as well, as you're thinking about ways to communicate with your donors. And different people are a different way, but those are some key tips that I found helpful as you're trying to navigate this.
That's awesome. Now, I'll say that Noah, on his worst day, just speaking is probably a better communicator than me for sure, even if I've got a keyboard and I've got hours to polish it. So it's probably not fair. But those are some great things that you can do.
Your self-deprecation. Yeah, take a lesson from Scott. Self-deprecation is always a good thing. Gratitude, compliments. I appreciate it, Scott.
So what are some things you can do in Virtuous right now? I'll go through these relatively quickly, because I want to make sure we have time to address questions that are coming in. And if anybody has questions about some of these specific things, even after the webinar, can always connect and go over some of these together. But one of the easiest things to do, so we've been talking about, here, let's switch over to Virtuous proper. Woo, there we go. We've been talking about personally connecting with donors. That's one of the things that I think really needs to happen. And while getting an email from, again, every company under the sun is kind of neat and everything, I think it's even better, again, to have a personal communication. And so one of the best ways to do that is by phone. And so one of the easy steps to take would be to say, hey, everybody who is a major donor, who is under management, who has an MGO assigned or someone assigned to manage the relationship, just someone on staff, we want to make sure that we're not just saying, hey, please call everybody. I can quickly create a list of tasks so that they can call all the people that they have in their group and connect with them and say hi. And that's actually a really quick and easy thing for you to do, and then to replicate for all the different folks that might own those relationships. So from the query tool, if I go in and build a contact query, right, I have a pretty straightforward query that I can build because I would be using organization group, right? That's the best way to identify portfolios or contact ownership or relationship management would be the organization group function. And those of you who've been on these webinars before know I always use as my example one Mr. Fozzie Bear. So organization group is any of, we've got good old Fozzie. He's been a great MGO for years, right? So I want everybody who is in Fozzie's group. So this is going to be the Fozzie call list. There we go. And when I view those results, it'll say, hey, there's 25 people on his list. I can go to actions and I can add a task for all of these contacts, right? And it assumes that I'd like this to be done in about a week. If I'd like to make this more urgent, I can say no by next Tuesday, however it is. Call and check on donor. And I want to assign that to Fozzie. Yes, I understand. I'm going to add a task to all 25 of these contacts. It'll give you this big warning. Don't change your query, right? Because it's going to use that query to create those tasks. And then it'll assign all of those tasks to Fozzie so that he can go ahead and start making calls to everybody that he has in his group. Again, it's a one-line query. It's not super crazy to do. Then you can take it and then you can replicate that for anybody else that you have that owns, a group of contacts. When Fozzie gets those assignments, right? Here I am over here, logged in as one Mr. Fozzie Bear. You can tell my screen looks a little bit different here. But once Fozzie gets all those tasks assigned to him and that job runs, he'll have his call list here on his task screen. I don't think it's complete yet, but we can always check and see. Nope. He'll have all of his tasks listed for him here on his dashboard, and then he can start running through those calls to check in on every donor that he has in his group. So really easy, really quick. You can go ahead and run with that one. Now we've talked about segmentation. And we also mentioned having sort of a really basic workflow just to communicate with donors. And so to combine both of those things, because I kind of used both in a very simple workflow. And again, it's designed to do just what we've been talking about here, which is to reach out, to connect, to say, hey, how are you doing? Here's how we're doing. And here's how you can help us and how can we help you, right? How can we help each other through this scenario? So I've got a really simple workflow here. And this has 4 steps. Now we tend to think of workflow steps as being sequential, as this kind of moving from left to right, but this is actually a little bit of a different workflow. These are all steps that run in parallel. So this is actually designed to segment some of the messaging to these different groups. And I've got 4 key groups here. And this is another approach to doing some of what we just did from the query, but adding to it. And so here what we've got on the far right, I've got 2 different MGOs. I've got Fozzie, I've got good old Solicitor X here. And we've got everybody who's in their group. Everybody who's under management and is in their group. We've got a query to identify those folks. And we've got an outreach email that is being sent from Fozzie. So it's a little bit more personalized. This one's coming from Solicitor X, a little bit more personalized, coming from them just to say hey and to check in on their donor. And they're also getting assigned that task to do a little check-in call with their donor. So instead of doing the bulk assignment, I'm going to have automation go ahead and assign those calls to them. And then I have 2 other groups over here on the left. I've got active donors within the last 2 years, kind of hitting on one of Clay's points, right? Which is, hey, I don't want to reach out to folks who haven't given in years, to whom I'm not really relevant at all, right? But folks who have given within the last 2 years. And you can add even folks who have volunteered in the last year to that as well. They're getting outreach here from our development director, and then they're getting a check-in call as well. And then we're sending a follow-up email to them right? After a few days, and that follow-up email, the message there is, hey, we're in this together. We can do this together, right, as a partnership. And then the core donor outreach. And so these core donors, these are the folks who have given for 5 years. This is probably the one query I want to take a quick look at here. I mentioned those really loyal donors, those who have given for several consecutive years. They're really the ones that you want to look to, because they're the ones who have shown that you really have a place in their heart, right? And so here, they're getting an email that's coming from the executive director and a call from the executive director. Gabe Cooper is going to step into that role here, and then follow up from him as well. So they're getting a little bit of a higher level of attention. Notice they're not major donors, right? So they might not even be used to getting this kind of call from the executive director, but they are people who have been vital to our success for a long time. We want to let them know that. And so this query to identify these folks is an interesting one, because we've got some statistics going back, right, for the last 3 years to look at how many gifts someone has given. And so we've got here their last year plus pass-through gift count. So last year, right, meaning 2019, because it's so early in 2020, I don't really want to discount someone based on what they've already done in 2020, right? They may not have given yet. But looking at then second last year, so that's 2018, and then 2017 here is third last year. So have they given in all 3 of those years, right? Was their last gift at least 1 year ago, right? Because that last year plus pass-through gift count, well, there's a couple months there where they might not have given all that recently. And then we're using the nested query function here to include giving from 2016 and 2015. So I've got 2 gift queries that all those queries are is, and I can show you that the gift date, right? So we look at this 2016 gifts, very simple query again. Gift date is between 1/1/2016, 12/31/2016. That's all. But then we're using those to really actually go back an additional 5 years to identify folks who have given that many times consistently, that many years consistently. And then we have an OR here just to incorporate their last pass-through gift date as well. And this actually comes out to a smaller group of donors, as you might imagine. But then having them get a little bit more focused attention, even than they may have in the past, I think right now, that's a lot more important than it may have been before. And so this is really kind of doing both things, right? It's using automation to drive some of this outreach, and it's also using automation to segment that message. Even though the message is very similar, right? It's tailored just a little bit for each one of these groups because of who they are. Okay, and this is something, again, it's only a couple of steps. It's only a couple of emails, right? The time commitment here is going to be, creating the queries themselves and really making the calls, which is where you want that time to be spent anyway. But the workflow itself is not overly complex. Okay. So again, I know I ran through that a little bit quickly. I wanted to make sure we had some time to take some questions here. I'll field some of these questions and toss some questions to Noah as well to get his expertise. I know we did have a question about sources of some of this data. I did include some sources on some of the slides. I apologize. The decrease in grant funding, the decrease in corporate giving, the decrease in major gifts, that's actually came from multiple sources. So I didn't cite just one source. Some of that's been seen in Giving USA and in a couple of other places. And if anyone needs some follow-up sources, I'm happy to provide some additional content afterwards if anyone's curious. And I know we had someone who had asked about membership communications, and I think membership is kind of in the same boat in terms of making sure that you're reaching out. I mean, again, there's definitely a connection for folks who are part of that membership community. The same idea and the same sort of concepts apply to that type of communication in terms of reaching out to them, connecting with them, making sure A, that they're okay, and then B, letting them know how they can also be supportive of you at this time. Noah, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that one.
No, I think you covered it. It's really just about communication that's clear, that's keeping people engaged, and really serving people in a way that uniquely. I think what's been interesting, and I think this might relate to another question, is I've been seeing a lot of organizations, like even Rachel mentioned, where they're almost like now becomes like COVID-19 like information experts or something, when it's like just so far outside of their business and it comes across in a way that doesn't feel authentic to the organization. But I do think there's unique value that each organization can provide. So I spent 7 years working in international development nonprofits. And the unique lens that we would have in this moment, which I've been seeing the organization do, is just sharing how this is impacting impoverished communities around the world that we serve in. So it's providing that lens of interest that's still relatable to your mission, and making sure you're communicating that. So that would be the same with membership communication.
Excellent. Yeah, and I saw, Rachel, you did have a question about that, striking the right tone and not really pretending to be a COVID expert. I think certainly sharing some resources is not a bad thing, but you don't want to position those as being resources coming from your organization, right? You are not public health experts. You are
Yeah.
not the source for a lot of this sort of information. But again, in the interest of checking in on your donors and sharing maybe relevant information with them at a high level, I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think you need to get too deep into, hey, here are the steps to take if you think you have
Yeah.
COVID. I don't think you have to go down that road.
I think the other thing I wanted to comment related to this question is that your tone of your communication should mirror what your brand's overall tone typically is. So you don't want to push far away from that if you have a consistent tone and voice that you typically communicate from. Maybe that's more formalized, maybe it's more, more casual, maybe it's, data driven versus conversation driven. You want to maintain that posture and tone while still being more, obviously sensitive to the circumstance. So I don't think your tone should change from what your normal brand tone is. It should just be on the more sensitive side of whatever that range typically is that you have. And I say all that, you don't want to lose yourself in the midst of the communication either. You still want to stay consistent because, again, we're going to get through this. It's going to end at some point, and you want to be able to leverage now to actually build stronger relationships with donors that are going to last way longer than any of this crisis or current times.
Yes. And there's another question that I'm glad it got asked, and I feel like part of it here is pretty good. But Alex had asked about debating postponing their spring appeal, and they mentioned after this webinar. I feel like it's more important than ever. And yes, it's absolutely more important. This may change, kind of like what I've said, and certainly what Noah said. This may change the tone, it may change the message, it may change the tactics for your spring appeal. But overall, this is not the time to stop fundraising. And even though it may be a harder time to do it, it's also not a time to stop acquisition, right? You look at organizations that in past recessions, during 9/11, during all these other crises that sort of cut themselves off at the knees because they started to slash some of the, they wanted to cut some budget, and so they started to cut acquisition or acquisition mailings, because the fact is that compounds. And so years later, as we rebound from this, and we know that we will, you put yourself in a very precarious position if you've really cut off that acquisition channel for your organization.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you always have to be building. You always want to be focusing on retention and retaining donors. You always need to acquire new donors, and you always need to be cultivating and deepening relationships with donors. Those three things don't change. I think how you approach it in times of crisis may. But just to add a little bit more practical side of what Scott just said, is a lot of inventory in online right now, and digital ads or other things are actually there's a larger inventory, so you're getting a cheaper price for some of those things. So that's another way that there's actually ways to amplify content digitally because there's increased inventory, and the prices are cheaper. So if you have the ability or you already are doing it, now is actually a time to really double down on some of that work, because it's going to pay off in the long run as you build your community during this time. Even if it's not through a fundraising ask, it might be through, you know, a lead generation tool or like content offer or educational webinars that you're hosting. But that's all going to help you build up an audience right now that you can then engage maybe in more of a financial way in the future as times let up. So, but Sarah has a great question, a last question. I think she says, you mentioned focusing on bequests. Do you think that's really appropriate during a public health emergency? and I think your question is very valid, Sarah. Scott, any advice on that?
Yeah, well, so it's funny. I always used to have that same sort of squidgy feeling about planned giving, and I think there's a lot of people that do. I had the opportunity to work with someone who that was their bread and butter, was planned giving, and they said, no, it's not a squidgy or a dirty thing, right? To make that planned giving ask, as long as you frame it correctly. And so you don't want to say to somebody, you know, hey, it looks like you're not long for this world given everything going on. So have you thought about what's going to happen after you pass on? No, but that would be terrible. But if you say to somebody, hey, you know, you've been a great supporter of ours. We're trying to do everything that we can to continue providing the programming that we do, or to continue fulfilling the mission that we've been working towards together. And we're hoping to continue to do that. We know we'll get through this. Have you thought about making a legacy gift to the organization in terms of your estate planning? There are folks who, you know, you have to make the ask to the right people. But when you frame it the right way and you make that ask in the right way, it's something that makes sense to those donors. That's in a lot of cases, the donors that care the most about you, that is the biggest and most significant gift that they can give you. Every single fundraiser that I've chatted with, I mean, so many people have that apocryphal story, which is not apocryphal, it happens all the time, of that lovely donor that sent in an envelope of cash, or they sent a small check of $10, you know, like clockwork every couple of months or every year, because it was all they could afford and because they loved the organization. And then when that person died, they left everything they had to the organization, and suddenly they went, oh my gosh, we got $1 million bequest from this little old lady. We never knew that she could do this, or that this would happen. So those folks that want to see you succeed and they want to see that continue, even after they're gone. So yeah, you don't want to frame it as in light of the public health crisis, you want to make this gift, right? That's simply something that someone can do to support you in the future. That's really it, right? It's sort of more of a sustainable way to support the work that you do. And I should say,
And
I'm also
I think
not a plan
generally
giving
it's
expert,
also,
but yeah.
yeah, I think in general though, it's just making sure we maintain this hope that there is another side to this, and that there is a bigger picture here, and the work that we're all doing is uh, not above the current crisis, but is also important. And so I feel like the general tone is just keep going, keep fundraising, you know, stay positive. You know, we are, as Clay said, in the hope business, and so that really should be at the forefront of everything we do now and in the future.
Right. And fundraising is not a dirty word. It's not a bad thing. We know that. And it isn't now, right? It hasn't become a dirty word simply because there's something going on in the world. As a matter of fact, nonprofits at a time like this are more vital than they are typically, right? And so many folks are providing crucial services. This is when a lot of nonprofits have a real spotlight shined on them, right? You start seeing news stories about human services organizations, like Noah mentioned, about the zoo and all these other organizations. You look at who is stepping up and filling the gap right now, and it's nonprofits across the board that are doing that. right? And so it's not a time to shy away from saying, hey, we're able to do this because of support from awesome folks like you. Okay, I know we went a couple minutes over our time. Loved answering questions. If you have more questions, if you are curious about something, if you want to follow up on something, you guys can join in the conversation. If you haven't done it already, if you've seen the email that came out earlier this week, you can join the Virtuous community on Slack. Right? Slack is the hip thing to do now that everybody's working from home anyway. There is a link in the chat. Noah had posted that there to be able to join that Slack community. If you didn't see it there, you should also have it in your email inbox. But go ahead and jump in and join in the conversation. That's where you can share ideas. You can share some success stories and strategies. There's actually a channel there dedicated to talking about strategies that folks are using right now in light of the current crisis. So you can go in there and either get some great ideas from other folks, or please share something that you're doing that you're seeing work, so that other folks can benefit from that too. It's a great place to do it. Noah has been the mastermind behind making this available as the director of the community. He's done a great job with it, so go ahead and join in. Happy to have you in the conversation. All right, I think that'll do it for us, so we don't blow up the rest of everybody's Thursday. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Noah, for being the special featured guest star.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks again, everyone.
All right, and best of luck, everybody. And just remember, keep fundraising. All right, thanks, everybody.